The look of utter shock on my husband's face when I slid the company ownership documents across the table, just moments after he'd announced he was leaving me for his 32-year-old secretary, is a memory I'll cherish until my dying day. My name is Margaret Wilson, and for nearly 4 decades of marriage, I had quietly become the majority shareholder of the very business empire my husband believed was solely his achievement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This photograph was taken almost 50 years ago. Me at 22, standing beside Harold, on our wedding day. We had just graduated from State University where I'd earned my business degree with honors, though Harold often told people we'd met while I was studying something in the arts. The hopeful smile on my face reflected dreams we shared about building something meaningful together, though I couldn't have imagined how differently we'd each defined together as decades passed. I was raised in a small manufacturing town where my mother ran the family's textile business after my father's unexpected death. "Always maintain your independence, Maggie," she would say while teaching me accounting after school. "Men respect what they can see on the surface, but your security depends on what you build quietly beneath." That wisdom would prove prophetic, 40 years later in ways neither of us could have imagined. I married Harold when his ambition was still housed in a rented garage where he repaired office equipment. What he lacked in capital, he made up for with charisma. What I brought was business strategy and financial discipline I'd learned at my mother's side, though Harold preferred introducing me at functions as the supportive wife with the good head for household budgeting. When we secured our first small business loan, the loan officer directed all questions to Harold despite my business degree and the fact that I had prepared all the financial projections. After that humiliating experience, we developed an unspoken arrangement. Harold would be the public face, while I structured the financial foundation from behind the scenes. By our 15th anniversary, I had made a pivotal decision. Rather than investing my unpaid labor and financial insights solely into Harold's increasingly independent vision, I would begin building my own position within the company structure, not through title or recognition, but through carefully acquired ownership. My first stock purchase occurred when Harold restructured the company in our 17th year of marriage. While he focused on the prestige of the new corporate headquarters, I quietly arranged to acquire shares through a separate investment entity called Margot Ventures, named for my mother's family. Harold, now accustomed to handling what he called the big picture decisions, delegated the paperwork to me with minimal review. "Just make sure the ownership percentages reflect my position as founder and CEO," he instructed before leaving for a golf retreat. What he didn't notice in the documents he hastily signed was that while he maintained majority control, my separate investment entity had secured a meaningful initial position that could grow over time. For the next 20 years, as Wilson Office, Solutions expanded into technology services and eventually a regional business conglomerate. I methodically increased Margot Ventures' ownership through strategic investments. Each time the company needed additional capital, I ensured my separate entity participated, always legally sound, but never identified as connected to me personally. Harold's knowledge of my involvement remained superficial. He was vaguely aware that I dabbled in company stock as he characterized it, but the extent of my ownership position remained obscured by legitimate corporate structures and his own disinterest in what he considered financial minutiae. "Margaret has her little investment hobby," he once told our accountant within my hearing. "It keeps her busy while I handle the actual business." The accountant, who understood exactly how substantial my hobby had become, maintained professional neutrality while meeting my eyes briefly over Harold's shoulder. By our 35th anniversary, Margot Ventures had acquired 37% of Wilson Enterprise Group, while Harold's personal ownership had diluted to 42% through various transactions he hadn't fully understood when approving. The remaining shares were distributed among minor investors and executives with no knowledge of my connection to Margot Ventures. The warning signs of Harold's wandering attention became apparent during our 38th year of marriage. Business trips grew longer, weekend work became more frequent, and his enthusiastic descriptions of his new executive assistant's capabilities seemed excessive. Jennifer Sullivan had joined the company at 29, with modest qualifications but remarkable ability to make Harold feel even more impressive than he already considered himself. By our 40th anniversary, a milestone Harold suggested we celebrate. Later, due to an essential business trip that happened to include Jennifer, I had increased Margot Ventures' ownership to 48% through strategic transactions during the company's recent acquisition phase. Harold's personal stake had reduced to 39%, though his controlling influence remained intact through voting arrangements he believed were permanent, but which contained contingencies he had never bothered to review. The culmination came 3 months later. Harold arrived home unusually early one Wednesday, appearing both uncomfortable and oddly energized. He suggested we sit in the formal living room rather than the comfortable family room where I had been reviewing quarterly financials. "Margaret, we need to talk about our future," he began with practiced solemnity. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what we both need at this stage of life." I set aside my reading glasses as he delivered a prepared speech about different directions and growing apart, eventually arriving at his actual point. He had developed feelings for Jennifer, who understands the real me, and they had decided to build a life together. "I'll be generous in the settlement, of course," he assured me, shifting to what he clearly considered the business portion of this personal transaction. "The house, appropriate maintenance, your personal investments, all taken care of. Jennifer. And I thought it might be easier if I moved out this weekend." His confidence was absolute. In his mind, he controlled all meaningful assets, and his generosity would determine my financial future. The company, his company, as he had always framed it, would naturally remain under his control. "That sounds very organized," I replied calmly. "Before you finalize these arrangements, though, there's something you should know about the company ownership structure." His expression registered momentary confusion before settling into condescending patience. "The corporate structure is quite complicated, Margaret. I don't think we need to get into those details right now." "Actually, Harold, those details are quite relevant," I continued, retrieving a folder I had begun preparing months earlier when Jennifer's expanding role made Harold's intentions increasingly clear, particularly regarding who has authority to determine the financial aspects of our separation. His confusion deepened as I opened the folder containing comprehensive documentation of Margot Ventures' ownership position, my legal control of that entity, and the triggering conditions in Harold's employment contract that would activate upon his pursuit of divorce under certain circumstances. "This is documentation confirming that I currently control 48% of Wilson Enterprise Group compared to your 39%, I explained matter-of-factly. "And this section outlines the contingency clause that transfers voting control upon dissolution of our marriage under circumstances involving workplace relationships." Harold's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief as he processed information that completely contradicted his understanding of our respective positions. "This can't be right," he insisted, scanning documents that were clearly authentic. "Margot Ventures is one of our institutional investors." "Margot Ventures is me, Harold," I clarified. "It has been for 23 years, through every expansion, acquisition, and restructuring you approved without reading the details. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known your true value, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Because in part 2, you'll see exactly what happened when Harold realized the full implications of his situation and the unexpected way the company leadership and Jennifer herself responded to this dramatic power reversal." Harold stared at the documents spread across our formal living room table, his face cycling through emotions I'd rarely seen him display in our 40 years together: shock, confusion, anger, and finally, a creeping fear that I found surprisingly unfamiliar on his features. This is some kind of trick, he finally managed, pushing the papers away as if distance might change their contents. You can't possibly control the company. I built Wilson Enterprise Group from nothing. We built it, I corrected gently. The difference is that I kept records of my contribution while you were busy taking credit. How long have you been planning this? Harold demanded, his voice shifting to the authoritative tone he typically used when feeling threatened in business settings. This feels calculated, Margaret. About as calculated as your relationship. With Jennifer, I replied, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well through decades of being underestimated. The difference is that my actions were defensive, not deceptive. Everything documented in these papers was properly executed, fully legal, and signed by you. Harold reached for the company ownership records again, examining them more carefully this time. I could see his mind working, the financial executive I'd watched operate for decades, as he searched for loopholes or technicalities that might invalidate what he was seeing. The board won't stand for this, he finally said, though with noticeably less conviction than before. They're loyal to me. I selected each one personally. The board is loyal to shareholder value, I corrected. Something I've been quietly protecting while you've been increasingly distracted by personal interests. I've had private conversations with several key members over the past few months, expressing concerns about management stability. This was another revelation Harold hadn't anticipated. While he'd been planning his exit from our marriage, I had been methodically securing my position with the board members he assumed were exclusively his allies. You went behind my back to the board? The betrayal in his voice was ironic, given the circumstances that had brought us to this confrontation. I spoke with them as the company's largest individual shareholder, with legitimate concerns about leadership succession, I clarified. Which, given your current announcement about leaving your wife for an employee 38 years your junior, now appears remarkably prescient. Harold stood abruptly and paced across the living room, stopping at the large window that overlooked the garden I had meticulously maintained while he built what he considered his independent success. The evening light cast long shadows across the lawn as the implications of his new reality settled over him. What exactly do you want, Margaret? He finally asked, still facing the window. Is this about money? A bigger settlement? The question revealed how fundamentally he still misunderstood the situation. Even now, he believed this was a negotiating tactic rather than the culmination of decades of strategic positioning. This isn't about extracting concessions, Harold. This is about acknowledging the actual power dynamics in our relationship, both personal and professional. I gathered the documents back into their folder with deliberate precision. I don't need to negotiate for what I already legally control. He turned back toward me, his expression hardening into something more familiar. The calculated assessment he applied to business challenges. You realize this will damage the company. A public fight for control during divorce proceedings will tank the stock value and frighten clients. Which is precisely why there won't be a public fight, I replied. The transition documentation is already prepared. You'll announce your early retirement due to personal reasons, and I'll step in as interim chairperson while the board conducts a formal search for new executive leadership. You've thought of everything, he said, a grudging acknowledgement in his voice. I've had 40 years of watching you take credit for my thinking, Harold. It tends to sharpen one's strategic planning skills. The silence that followed was heavy with 4 decades of unspoken truths. Harold had built his identity around being the visionary business leader, the self-made success story. Discovering that his dismissed wife had quietly become his majority shareholder challenged not just his immediate plans, but his entire self-concept. And Jennifer? He finally asked, the question revealing his priorities even in this moment of personal and professional crisis. Ms. Sullivan will be transferred to our Minneapolis office, effective immediately. Her continuing employment will depend entirely on her professional conduct and performance, not her personal relationships. Harold's face tightened. You can't dictate who I'm not dictating your personal choices, I interrupted. I'm establishing appropriate corporate boundaries as the controlling shareholder. What you do in your private life after our divorce is your business. Who holds management positions in the company is mine. The ringing doorbell interrupted our standoff. Harold glanced toward the entryway with visible confusion. We rarely received unannounced visitors, particularly on weekday evenings. That would be Patricia Winters, I explained, rising to answer. The door. My attorney. I thought it would be efficient to begin the separation agreement documentation immediately. You invited your lawyer here? Now? Harold's stunned expression suggested he was still struggling to grasp how thoroughly I had prepared for this moment. Actually, she's both my personal attorney and outside counsel for Margot Ventures. Given the complexity of our situation, her presence will ensure all actions are properly documented from the outset. The distinguished silver-haired woman who entered our living room moments later carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to navigating high-stakes business transitions. After brief introductions, Patricia placed her briefcase on the coffee table and efficiently laid out a preliminary separation agreement that reflected the new power reality Harold was still struggling to absorb. As you'll see, Mr. Wilson, these terms are quite reasonable given the circumstances, Patricia explained in her characteristic no-nonsense manner. Mrs. Wilson will assume chairperson responsibilities at Wilson Enterprise Group while maintaining majority shareholder position. Through Margot Ventures, you'll transition to emeritus status with appropriate benefits and board observer privileges, though without voting authority. Harold stared at the documents without touching them. And if I contest this arrangement? Patricia's expression remained professionally neutral. Contesting would trigger the moral conduct clauses in your employment contract, potentially resulting in termination without benefits. Additionally, given the circumstances of your relationship with a subordinate employee, litigation would likely involve discovery processes that could prove uncomfortable for all parties. The clinical precision with which she outlined the consequences of resistance seemed to finally penetrate Harold's shock. He had spent decades navigating business negotiations from positions of leverage, but now found himself without viable countermoves. I need time to review this with my own counsel, he finally said, the businessman in him asserting one last attempt at procedural delay. Of course, I agreed. You have until tomorrow afternoon. The board has been called for an emergency session at 4 p.m. to address leadership transition concerns. His head snapped up. The board meeting is already scheduled, before I've even agreed to anything? The meeting was called to address legitimate governance concerns raised by significant shareholders, Patricia clarified. Your personal decisions have created potential liabilities that the board must address regardless of your preferences about timing. As Patricia gathered her materials to leave, promising to return the following day for the signed documents, the full implications of his situation seemed to finally register with Harold. His carefully planned exit, leaving his aging wife while maintaining control of the company and starting a new life with his young assistant, had collapsed entirely, replaced by a humiliating reality in which he had lost control of both the narrative and the company he believed was unquestionably his. After Patricia departed, Harold retreated to his home office without further discussion. Through the closed door, I could hear him making phone calls, likely to his personal attorney and possibly to Jennifer, though I chose not to speculate on those conversations. What mattered was that the careful groundwork I had laid over decades had created a position of strength precisely when I most needed it. The following morning brought the first test of our new reality. I had risen early, as was my habit, and was reviewing final documentation for the board meeting when Harold appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in his usual impeccable business attire, but with visible signs of a sleepless night. I spoke with Jennifer last night, he announced without preamble, pouring himself coffee from the pot I had prepared. She's refusing the Minneapolis transfer. That's certainly her prerogative, I replied calmly. Her letter of resignation will be accepted immediately. with standard non-compete and confidentiality provisions enforced. Harold's expression tightened. She's planning to accompany me to the board meeting this afternoon to address these changes directly. This was an unexpected development, though not entirely surprising given Jennifer's ambition and Harold's likely misrepresentation of his continuing authority. I considered my response carefully before replying. Jennifer is currently a mid-level executive without board access privileges. Her presence would be inappropriate for a governance discussion. I met Harold's gaze directly. However, if you're determined to create a public confrontation, I should note that I've prepared a comprehensive file documenting questionable expense allocations and potential conflicts of interest regarding her rapid promotion path and compensation adjustments. The implied threat was clear without being explicit. Pushing this into open conflict would result in revelations that would damage both Harold's reputation and Jennifer's career prospects well beyond Wilson Enterprise Group. "This isn't over, Margaret," Harold said quietly, though the resignation in his voice suggested he recognized the futility of immediate resistance. "On the contrary," I replied, gathering my materials into the leather portfolio my mother had given me on my 50th birthday. "After 40 years of working in your shadow while building my own position, things are just beginning." Harold left for the office without further discussion, presumably to prepare Jennifer for the reality neither of them had anticipated when plotting their future together. I spent the morning coordinating with Patricia and finalizing my presentation. For the board, a strange sense of calm replacing the uncertainty that had shadowed so much of my married life. By early afternoon, Patricia confirmed that Harold had signed the separation agreement with minimal modification, a pragmatic acceptance of his limited options given the comprehensive legal foundation we had established. The board meeting would proceed as planned, with Harold announcing his retirement for personal reasons, while I would be introduced as interim chairperson, pending formal leadership succession planning. The Wilson Enterprise Group headquarters looked impossibly different as I approached it that afternoon. Not because the gleaming glass tower had changed, but because my relationship to it had transformed completely. For decades, I had entered this building as Harold's wife, a peripheral figure occasionally attending company functions. Today, I arrived as the controlling shareholder prepared to assume formal leadership. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 of this story, I recommend watching them first to understand how my husband of 40 years announced he was leaving me for his young secretary, only to discover I secretly owned the majority of his company. The executive elevator, the one Harold had always used while I typically took the general access lifts when visiting, whisked me directly to the 43rd floor where the boardroom occupied the prime corner position overlooking the city skyline. Patricia walked beside me, her confident presence a reminder that this transition was not merely personal vindication, but a carefully orchestrated business restructuring. "The board members have all received the briefing documents?" I confirmed, as we approached the imposing mahogany doors. "Delivered securely this morning," Patricia nodded. 7 of the 9 have already acknowledged receipt and review. Based on preliminary responses, you have clear majority support for the transition plan." This confirmation settled the last whisper of uncertainty. While I had methodically built my ownership position and cultivated relationships with key board members, today would be the first explicit test of their willingness to accept my leadership after decades of Harold's unquestioned authority. The boardroom fell silent as we entered. 8 people sat around the massive table, with Harold conspicuously positioned at the head position he had occupied for 25 years. His expression remained carefully neutral, though the slight tightness around his eyes betrayed the strain of maintaining this facade. What surprised me was Jennifer's presence, seated not at the administrative position near the door as would be appropriate for her role, but directly beside Harold in the space typically reserved for the CFO. Her youth appeared even more pronounced in this setting, surrounded by executives with decades of experience, yet her posture projected practiced confidence. "Margaret," Harold acknowledged with forced cordiality, "and Ms. Winters." We were just reviewing the quarterly projections while waiting. The deliberate attempt to frame this as a routine meeting rather than the leadership transition we all knew was coming represented Harold's last attempt to control the narrative. I smiled pleasantly while taking the open seat directly opposite him at the table's far end, not the peripheral position he likely expected me to choose. "Thank you all for accommodating this special session," I began, opening my portfolio deliberately. As the briefing materials outlined, we're addressing significant governance transitions necessitated by recent developments. Before I could continue, Jennifer leaned forward with a smile that appeared professionally warm, but couldn't quite conceal her underlying tension. "Before we begin, I wanted to introduce myself properly to those board members I haven't yet met. Personally, I'm Jennifer Sullivan, Senior Executive Advisor to Mr. Wilson, and newly appointed Director of Strategic Initiatives." The tactical move was immediately clear. Harold had apparently created a new executive title for Jennifer overnight, attempting to solidify her position before the transition. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the transparent maneuver for what it was. "That's an interesting development," I replied calmly, "especially since executive appointments require board governance committee approval, which doesn't appear on any recent meeting minutes." Richard Matthews, the longest-serving board member and former university colleague of Harold's, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Harold mentioned a temporary special assignment this morning, pending formal approval processes." "I see." I met Harold's gaze directly across the table. "Well, we can address reporting structures after resolving the primary agenda items. Patricia, would you distribute the signed transition agreements?" As Patricia efficiently handed documents to each board member, Harold's attempt to seize control of the narrative collapsed. The materials clearly outlined his signed agreement to transition to emeritus status, while I assumed interim chairperson responsibilities, effective immediately. "As you can see," I continued once everyone had received their copies, "Harold has recognized that personal circumstances necessitate leadership restructuring to ensure company stability. We've developed a comprehensive transition plan that maintains operational continuity while initiating a formal succession planning process." Jennifer's composed expression faltered as she scanned the documents, clearly seeing for the first time the details of Harold's diminished position. She turned to him with questioning eyes, but Harold kept his attention fixed firmly on the papers before him. Elizabeth Chen, the newest board member and CEO of a major technology firm, spoke first. "These terms appear remarkably generous given the circumstances, Harold. Emeritus status with full benefits and continuing board observer privileges represents significant accommodation." Her framing, that the arrangement favored Harold rather than penalized him, skillfully established the tone for the discussion. As a widely respected executive who had joined our board just 8 months earlier, Elizabeth's perspective carried particular weight with the other members. Harold recognized the shifting dynamic but attempted one final assertion of the authority he had wielded for decades. "While I appreciate the consideration, I believe a more gradual transition would better serve company interests. Perhaps a 6-month co-leadership arrangement would—" "The signed agreements don't provide for that option," Patricia interjected, smoothly. "And given the potential conflicts of interest created by recent personal developments, governance best practices strongly recommend immediate and clear leadership delineation." The professional phrasing thinly veiled the underlying reality. Harold's affair with his much younger employee had created an untenable corporate liability that required decisive resolution. The board members exchanged glances, corporate survival, instincts clearly overriding personal loyalties. Richard Matthews sighed heavily before addressing Harold directly. "We've worked together for a long time, Harold, and I've always respected your business acumen. But this situation," he gestured vaguely toward Jennifer, "creates complications we can't ignore. The transition plan protects both your legacy and the company's stability. I recommend we implement it as presented." "Jennifer, suddenly recognizing how completely her position had collapsed, attempted to salvage something from the rapidly deteriorating situation. As someone who's worked closely with Harold on strategic initiatives, she began, her voice professionally modulated despite visible tension, I should note that several key client relationships are deeply personal connections that might be jeopardized by abrupt leadership changes. It was a calculated attempt to leverage fear of client defections, a legitimate business concern that might override governance considerations. I had anticipated this angle, however, and was prepared with a response that would definitively end her influence in this discussion. That's precisely why we've prepared personalized communications for our top 20 clients, to be delivered immediately following this meeting, I replied, removing another document from my portfolio. Additionally, I've arranged individual calls with the 7 strategic clients whose relationships you're likely referring to, Ms. Sullivan, including Westridge Financial and Arlington Properties. Jennifer's expression froze momentarily before she recovered her professional composure. The message was clear. I knew exactly which client relationships she had been involved with, undermining her implied threat of unique access or influence. The board vote that followed was merely a formality. The transition plan was approved unanimously, with Harold abstaining rather than opposing, a final concession to preserving at least the appearance of dignity. As the meeting concluded, board members approached me individually with congratulations that carried varying degrees of surprise at my previously unrecognized capabilities. I've always wondered about the financial structures behind our acquisition. Strategy, Elizabeth Chen commented quietly as others filtered from the room. The elegance of those approaches seemed inconsistent with Harold's typically more aggressive style. I suspect I've been admiring your work without realizing it. Her perceptiveness was unsurprising given her own remarkable career trajectory. Harold has many strengths, I acknowledged diplomatically. But yes, the international portfolio diversification and multi-tiered acquisition financing approaches were primarily my contributions. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss those strategies in detail sometime, she replied with genuine professional interest. Perhaps after the transition dust settles. This unexpected moment of authentic recognition from a respected peer, something I had rarely experienced during decades of behind-the-scenes contribution, felt more validating than the formal power transfer itself. Elizabeth departed with a promise to call later in the week, leaving just Harold, Jennifer, Patricia, and myself in the massive boardroom. The uncomfortable silence was finally broken by Patricia's practical efficiency. I have the formal announcements prepared for distribution, she noted, checking her watch. The external press release is scheduled for 5:30, with internal communication preceding it by 30 minutes. Is there anything either of you wish to modify in the language previously reviewed? She directed this question to Harold and me, pointedly excluding Jennifer from the decision process. Harold shook his head slightly, his earlier combativeness replaced by resigned acceptance of his new reality. Jennifer, however, was not prepared to exit quietly. This won't work, she stated flatly, addressing me directly for the first time. You may control the shares, Mrs. Wilson, but you don't understand the operational complexities of this business. The executive team has been built around Harold's leadership approach. They won't simply transfer loyalty to someone they view as an outsider who acquired power through marital technicality. The assessment wasn't entirely incorrect. Transitioning an organization built on Harold's personality to new leadership would present challenges beyond merely having legal authority. What Jennifer failed to understand was how thoroughly I had prepared for precisely this aspect of the situation. An insightful concern, I acknowledged with professional courtesy, which is why I've spent the past 6 months having private discussions with each key executive about their departmental strategies, resource allocations, and professional development priorities. Conversations they found surprisingly valuable, given my comprehensive understanding of our operational nuances. Harold's head snapped up at this revelation. You've been meeting with my executive team? Without my knowledge? Not as your wife, I clarified. As a major shareholder concerned with succession planning and organizational development, conversations that have laid important groundwork for this transition. The final pieces of understanding seemed to click into place for Harold, not just that I had acquired controlling ownership, but that I had methodically prepared the entire organization for a leadership transition while he remained completely unaware. The comprehensive nature of my strategy, developed and executed over months while he pursued his relationship with Jennifer, appeared to finally penetrate his resistance. "You've won, Margaret," he said quietly. "Completely and thoroughly. What happens now?" "Now we execute the transition plan with minimal disruption to the business," I replied matter-of-factly. "You'll announce your retirement, I'll assume interim leadership, and the board will initiate a formal search for permanent executive succession. A process that will include qualified internal candidates alongside external prospects." Your performance evaluations suggest reasonable capability in your actual role, separate from personal entanglements. If you wish to continue in your original position, not the unilaterally created strategic initiatives title, that option remains available, though the Minneapolis transfer offer stands if you prefer geographical separation from this situation. The offer wasn't based on generosity but practical business consideration. Forcing her immediate departure would create unnecessary organizational disruption and potential legal complications that served no strategic purpose. Offering continued employment under appropriate boundaries demonstrated both reasonable leadership and clear establishment of new power realities. Jennifer departed without accepting or rejecting the offer, leaving Harold and me alone in the boardroom, where he had reigned as unquestioned authority for decades. Through the wall of windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city skyline, a visual metaphor for the ending of his corporate dominance that seemed almost too perfect. 40 years, he said finally, his voice lacking its usual, authoritative resonance. 40 years we've been married, and I never truly knew what you were capable of. That's not entirely accurate, Harold, I corrected gently. You knew exactly what I was capable of. You simply chose to believe it belonged to you by default rather than recognizing it as independently valuable. A costly assumption, as it turns out. The morning after the board meeting, I arrived at Wilson Enterprise Group headquarters at precisely 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes before the executive team's regular briefing traditionally held in what had been Harold's office. For 40 years, I had organized my schedule around my husband's corporate routine. Now, that office and the authority it represented were mine. If you haven't seen parts 1 to 3 of this story, I recommend watching them first to understand how my husband's decision to leave me for his young secretary led to the revelation that I secretly controlled his company. As I stepped off the executive elevator, Harold's longtime assistant Diana rose from her desk with an expression that revealed both professional composure and personal uncertainty. At 61, Diana had been with the company almost as long as I'd been married to Harold, occupying the powerful gatekeeper position that controlled access to the CEO. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," she greeted me with formal courtesy. "The executive team has been notified of the meeting location change. They'll be gathering in the main conference room rather than—" She hesitated momentarily. "Rather than your office, as requested. My first executive decision had been deliberate. Moving the initial leadership meeting from Harold's personal domain to neutral territory. The psychological message was clear. This wouldn't simply be Harold's company with a different person sitting in his chair. This was a substantive transition to new leadership with its own distinct approach. "Thank you, Diana," I replied warmly. "And please, after all these years, I think Margaret would be more appropriate now." Her professional reserve softened slightly. "Of course, Margaret. The briefing materials are prepared, and I've taken the liberty of adding the quarterly divisional assessments you requested yesterday. This small interaction illustrated the first subtle but significant shifts already occurring throughout the organization. Diana, whose loyalty to Harold had been absolute for decades, was methodically transferring that institutional efficiency to the new leadership reality. Her capabilities hadn't changed, merely the direction in which they were applied. The executive team filtered into the conference room over the next 15 minutes. 7 division heads whose careers had developed entirely under Harold's leadership. Their expressions ranged from carefully neutral to openly curious as they took seats around the table. Most had interacted with me occasionally at company functions, but always as Harold's wife, never as a business authority. "Good morning," I began precisely at 7:30, opening the leather portfolio that had belonged to my mother. "Thank you for adjusting to the schedule changes on short notice. I recognize this transition raises natural questions about operational continuity and strategic direction." The conventional beginning seemed to slightly relax their visible tension. Elizabeth Chen had advised me during our evening call to acknowledge the uncertainty directly rather than pretending it didn't exist. Wisdom that reflected her own experience with corporate transitions. Before we address regular business matters, I want to establish 3 key principles for this interim leadership period, I continued. First, operational decisions will remain with divisional leadership unless broader integration is required. Second, the executive team structure remains unchanged while performance assessments proceed. And third, all strategic initiatives currently underway continue without disruption pending formal review. The message was clear. This would be evolution, not revolution. Several executives visibly relaxed at this assurance that their immediate authority remained intact. James Whitman, the veteran CFO who had worked alongside Harold for 18 years, spoke first. "Margaret, if I may call you that in this context, will you be maintaining the same reporting cadence and structure Harold established?" The question was practical, but also a subtle test of my familiarity with executive operations. "The weekly divisional updates and monthly consolidated reviews will continue," I confirmed. "However, I prefer comprehensive performance metrics rather than the selective highlights format. Diana has the revised templates for distribution today." This specific knowledge of their reporting deficiencies, something Harold had allowed to develop as executives learned to emphasize favorable data, sent a clear message. I wasn't entering this role with superficial understanding, but with detailed knowledge of their actual operations, including the informational gaps Harold had permitted. The 2-hour meeting proceeded with methodical efficiency. Each executive presented their critical updates. I asked targeted questions that demonstrated understanding of their divisional challenges, and we established clear next steps. By the session's conclusion, the initial wariness had evolved into cautious professional engagement, not yet full acceptance, but a workable foundation. As the executives departed, Michael Torres, our head of international operations and the youngest member of the leadership team, lingered behind. Once the room had cleared, he approached with measured respect. "I wanted to say something that might be inappropriate in the larger setting," he began carefully. "The Asia-Pacific expansion strategy, the one Harold has been pushing against for the past year. That original framework was your work, wasn't it?" The question surprised me. That particular strategy, a measured market entry I had developed based on cultural considerations rather than immediate profit potential, had been dismissed by Harold as overly cautious despite its long-term advantages. "What makes you think that?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perception. The approach was different, more nuanced in its understanding of relationship development across different regional business cultures, he explained. Harold's strategies typically emphasized rapid market penetration and immediate visibility. This plan valued subtlety and incremental trust building. It felt like different thinking. His perception was remarkably astute. "Yes, the original framework was my work," I acknowledged. though it was presented through appropriate channels rather than direct attribution. I suspected as much, he nodded. Some of us have occasionally wondered about the inconsistencies in our strategic approaches, moments of sophisticated cultural insight alongside more aggressive positioning. It makes more sense now. This unexpected recognition from a younger executive suggested that my behind-the-scenes influence had been more visible to perceptive observers than Harold had ever realized. As Michael departed with a respectful nod, I felt a moment of validation that transcended the formal authority transition. My distinct business thinking had been recognizable even when deliberately obscured. My first week as interim chairperson unfolded with similar moments of revelation and recalibration. Executives accustomed to Harold's decisive but often impulsive leadership style adjusted to my more methodical approach. Middle managers who had learned to present selectively edited information discovered I expected comprehensive analysis. Throughout the organization, the message spread. This wasn't merely a titular change, but a substantive shift in leadership philosophy. Jennifer Sullivan's response to the new reality took an unexpected turn. Rather than resigning immediately as many anticipated, she requested the Minneapolis transfer option, effectively removing herself from headquarters while maintaining employment. The decision reflected practical career preservation. At 32, with limited executive experience, her professional options were significantly better within the company than attempting to restart elsewhere with the complicated narrative of her relationship with Harold. Harold himself remained nominally connected through his emeritus status, though he had not appeared at headquarters since the transition announcement. According to Patricia, he had established temporary residence at his lake house 2 hours outside the city, physical distance that paralleled his removal from operational authority. Whether Jennifer had accompanied him remained unclear and deliberately outside my concern. The most significant early challenge emerged 10 days into my leadership when Westridge Financial, our second-largest client and one Harold had personally cultivated for over a decade, requested an urgent meeting to discuss relationship continuity under the new organizational structure. The implied uncertainty about maintaining their business under my leadership represented the first major test of client confidence. Elizabeth Chen offered strategic advice during our now regular evening calls. Client uncertainty following leadership. Transitions is normal, she observed from her own CEO experience, especially with relationships Harold deliberately personalized to enhance his perceived indispensability. Westridge is particularly concerning, I acknowledged. They represent nearly 12% of annual revenue, and Harold intentionally limited access to their executive team, which creates both challenge and opportunity, Elizabeth noted with characteristic insight. They're expecting to meet someone unfamiliar with their business, giving you the chance to decisively reset expectations by demonstrating deeper understanding than they anticipate. Following her advice, I spent the weekend immersed in Westridge's complete account history. Not just the summary reports Harold had presented to the board, but the detailed implementation documentation, financial structures, and service evaluations. By Monday morning, I had developed a comprehensive understanding far exceeding the superficial familiarity they would expect from Harold's previously invisible wife. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning, with Westridge's CEO Robert Blackwell and CFO Thomas Winters traveling to our headquarters, a power move suggesting they viewed themselves as the dominant party in our recalibrated relationship. I deliberately selected the main boardroom rather than the intimate conversation space Harold had always used for client meetings, subtly establishing that this discussion would proceed on my terms rather than theirs. When they arrived, Diana escorted them to the boardroom where I waited with James Whitman, our CFO, and Michael Torres, whose international expertise was relevant to Westridge's expansion ambitions. The subtle message was clear. They weren't meeting with an isolated and uncertain new leader, but with a cohesive executive team. "Gentlemen, welcome," I greeted them with professional warmth. "I understand you have questions about our continuing relationship under the leadership transition." Robert Blackwell, a man approximately Harold's age who had built his career in the same era of male-dominated financial services, made minimal effort to conceal his skepticism. "Margaret, I may call you that. This is obviously a significant change from our long-standing relationship with Harold. We've built considerable business together based on mutual understanding of industry dynamics." The implied concern was typical, that Harold's departure meant loss of the executive relationship they valued, necessitating either their departure, to follow him, or significant concessions to maintain their business. Their negotiating position assumed my desperation to retain their account would create leverage they could exploit. "Indeed, our companies have built substantial mutual value," I agreed pleasantly. "Which is why I wanted to address your Asia-Pacific alignment concerns before they became more pressing." The statement, referencing internal challenges they hadn't mentioned publicly, visibly startled both men. Their CFO recovered first. "You're familiar with our international structure?" "Not just familiar, but concerned about the potential regulatory complications with your current approach," I replied, opening my portfolio to reference specific details. "The reciprocal holding arrangement between your Singapore and Hong Kong subsidiaries creates unnecessary exposure under the revised oversight framework taking effect next quarter. We've developed an alternative structure that maintains operational flexibility while reducing compliance risk by approximately 43%. The substantive analysis, addressing problems they hadn't even raised yet, completely reset the conversation's dynamic. Rather than an obligatory courtesy meeting with Harold's replacement, they found themselves engaged with someone possessing deeper understanding of their business challenges than Harold had ever demonstrated. For the next 2 hours, we discussed detailed aspects of their business operations, international compliance considerations, and strategic positioning. With each exchange, their initial skepticism visibly transformed into genuine professional engagement. By the meeting's conclusion, Robert Blackwell's tone had shifted from condescending evaluation to collegial problem-solving. "I'll be direct, Margaret," he said as we concluded. "We came here expecting to begin transition planning to another provider. Harold had assured us his personal involvement was essential to your company's service model. Clearly, we were misinformed about where the actual expertise resided." The candid acknowledgement represented more than client retention. It was explicit. Recognition that Harold had deliberately cultivated dependencies to enhance his perceived value while obscuring my contributions. As they departed with renewed commitments rather than termination plans, I recognized this interaction would repeat with other key relationships Harold had personalized to magnify his own importance. As my third week of leadership began, patterns emerged that reflected both organizational recalibration and personal vindication. Executives who had initially approached me with cautious formality began bringing substantive challenges directly to my attention, discovering that my insights often resolved long-standing issues Harold had left unaddressed. Mid-level managers, particularly women who had struggled for recognition, found more receptive consideration of their perspectives than had been possible under previous leadership. 1 month into my leadership of Wilson Enterprise Group, I was reviewing quarterly projections late one evening when James Whitman, our veteran CFO, requested an urgent meeting. His typically composed demeanor showed unusual strain as he entered my office carrying a leather portfolio similar to the one my mother had given me decades earlier. "I've found something concerning," James began without preamble, placing several documents on my desk. Something Harold had compartmentalized outside normal reporting structures. The materials detailed a troubled acquisition Harold had personally championed 18 months earlier, Meridian Technologies, a software development firm that complemented our service portfolio, but had been performing significantly below projected targets. What made this situation unusual wasn't the underperformance itself, but the elaborate reporting structure Harold had created to obscure the actual results. The official board updates show Meridian meeting 85% of integration targets, James explained, pointing to familiar reports I'd seen at quarterly reviews. But these internal assessments tell a completely different story. They're actually achieving below 40% of projections while burning through capital at an unsustainable rate. As I examined the documentation, the magnitude of the concealment became clear. Harold had created a reporting firewall with adjusted figures presented to the board and executive team, while the actual performance data remained restricted to a small implementation group sworn to confidentiality. The deception wasn't merely misleading, it represented potential securities violations given our public company status. "How did you discover this?" I asked, noting the restricted server locations referenced in the document footers. Michael Torres found anomalies in international fund transfers related to Meridian's overseas development centers, James explained. When standard access channels didn't provide explanations, he approached me directly rather than going through traditional reporting lines. Together, we obtained authorized access to the restricted documentation based on financial compliance requirements. This revelation illustrated how quickly the organization's culture was evolving under my leadership. Under Harold, such independent investigation would have been considered overstepping, with executives expected to accept the information they were given rather than pursuing inconsistencies. The fact that Michael and James had felt empowered to investigate and then bring their findings directly to me represented meaningful organizational change just weeks into my tenure. "This requires immediate action," I noted, quickly assessing the implications, both to address the business situation and to correct the reporting violations before they become legally problematic. Harold was personally handling the turnaround strategy, James added carefully. He'd scheduled quarterly site visits that no one else attended, insisting he alone understood the necessary intervention approach. The situation crystallized Harold's leadership limitations in stark relief. Rather than acknowledging a strategic misstep and leveraging the executive team's collective expertise to address it, he had concealed the problem to protect his reputation as an infallible business leader. This pattern of prioritizing personal image over organizational health had clearly extended beyond his relationship with me to infect his corporate leadership approach. "We'll need to conduct a comprehensive assessment immediately," I decided. "Please assemble a small intervention team with appropriate expertise. Full operational transparency but contained to essential personnel until we understand the complete situation." "And the board?" James asked. "They've been receiving inaccurate information for over a year." "We'll prepare a full disclosure for the next meeting," I replied, with a detailed intervention plan already in development to accompany the revelation. Elizabeth Chen's technology background will be particularly valuable in evaluating realistic recovery options. The Meridian crisis consumed the next 2 weeks. Our assessment team discovered a situation far worse than even the hidden reports had indicated. Beyond performance issues, there were significant integration failures, cultural conflicts between the acquired team and our existing structure, and product development delays that threatened contractual obligations with major clients. The morning before the emergency board meeting, where we would disclose the full situation, I received an unexpected call from Patricia. "Harold has requested a private meeting," she informed me. "He says it's regarding mutual interests that require immediate discussion." The timing suggested he had somehow learned about our Meridian investigation, likely through remaining connections within the company. While my first instinct was to refuse any meeting outside formal channels, strategic consideration suggested potential value in understanding his perspective before the board disclosure. "I'll meet him at the Westlake Club," I decided, naming a private business venue where discretion was assured. "This afternoon, 3 o'clock. Please make it clear this is a one-time accommodation for specific business purposes only." The Westlake Club had been Harold's domain throughout our marriage, the exclusive space where he conducted his most sensitive business discussions and cultivated relationships with other executives. I had visited only occasionally for formal functions, always as his accessory rather than a member in my own right. Now I entered as the controlling shareholder and chairperson of Wilson Enterprise Group, with the membership recently transferred to my name. Harold waited in a private meeting room, his appearance noticeably different after just 6 weeks away from the company. The impeccable corporate presence he had maintained for decades had softened slightly, his hair trimmed less precisely, his clothing still professional, but lacking the meticulous perfection he had always demanded. Whether these changes reflected deliberate relaxation into early retirement or the impact of diminished status remained unclear. "Margaret," he acknowledged with careful neutrality. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. You mentioned mutual interest requiring discussion," I replied, taking the seat opposite him. "I assume this concerns Meridian Technologies." The direct reference visibly surprised him, confirming my suspicion about the meeting's purpose. "You know about the situation?" he stated rather than asked. "The actual situation, yes," I confirmed. "Not the manufactured narrative presented in official reports." Harold's expression tightened. Those reporting structures were designed to provide time for implementation of the turnaround strategy without creating unnecessary concern. Those reporting structures constituted deliberate misrepresentation to the board and potentially violated securities regulations, I corrected. The company is now exposed to significant legal and financial risk because you prioritized appearing infallible over responsible corporate governance. The blunt assessment hung between us, challenging the leadership mythology he had constructed over decades. After a moment, he sighed heavily, a rare acknowledgement of error I had seldom witnessed during our marriage. "The acquisition was meant to be transformative," he said finally, "positioning us for technology integration that would elevate the entire service model. The implementation challenges emerged after commitment, but I believed they were solvable with the right approach. Which might have been true if you'd engaged the collective expertise of the executive team rather than imposing isolated control," I noted. "Instead, you created an information silo that prevented actual solution development while the situation deteriorated." The observation struck at the core of Harold's leadership philosophy, that centralized control in the hands of a singular authority himself produced optimal outcomes. The Meridian disaster directly contradicted this belief, demonstrating how his approach had created vulnerable blind spots with significant consequences. "The board disclosure is scheduled for tomorrow," I continued when he didn't immediately respond. "We'll present both the actual situation and the comprehensive intervention plan already in development. Your presence isn't required, but would be appropriate given your direct involvement in both the acquisition and the reporting irregularities." Harold processed this information with visible calculation, weighing how his attendance might affect perception versus absence. "What does the intervention plan entail?" he asked finally. "A complete restructuring of the integration approach," I explained. "Leadership changes at Meridian, revised product development timelines with customer transparency, and implementation of proper reporting structures. Elizabeth Chen is personally involved given her technology sector expertise." The mention of Elizabeth's involvement seemed to finally penetrate Harold's remaining confidence in his indispensability. As one of the most respected technology executives in the industry, her direct engagement signaled commitment to actual resolution rather than image management. "I'll attend," he decided after consideration. "It's my responsibility to address this directly." The acknowledgement represented subtle but significant personal growth. Rather than deflecting accountability or attempting to control the narrative, he was accepting responsibility for his decisions, a standard I had rarely seen him apply to personal or professional missteps during our 40 years together. The board meeting the following day marked a pivotal moment in the company's evolution. With Harold present but seated among regular members rather than in his former position of authority, I led the executive team through a comprehensive disclosure of the Meridian situation, including both the performance realities and the reporting irregularities that had concealed them. Richard Matthews, Harold's longest-serving board ally, asked the question everyone was considering. How did this level of misreporting continue undetected through multiple review cycles? Rather than focusing blame directly on Harold, I addressed the structural issues that had enabled the situation. The previous leadership model centralized certain decisions with limited accountability mechanisms. Information flows were structured to concentrate control rather than ensure comprehensive oversight. Those governance weaknesses have been identified and addressed in our revised protocols. This approach, acknowledging the failures while focusing on systemic corrections rather than personal condemnation, set a tone that allowed productive discussion rather than defensive positioning. When Harold spoke, acknowledging his direct responsibility for both the acquisition strategy and the reporting approach, the moment reflected meaningful organizational maturation. The Meridian Intervention Plan represents our new leadership philosophy in action, I explained as we transitioned to solution development. Collaborative expertise engagement, transparent assessment regardless of impact on previous decisions, and accountable execution through clear milestone tracking. The comprehensive strategy our team presented, developed in just 2 weeks compared to Harold's 18 months of ineffective isolated management, demonstrated the tangible advantages of this revised approach. Elizabeth Chen's technical expertise had identified viable product path corrections, while Michael Torres had developed innovative organizational integration structures that addressed the cultural conflicts Harold had never fully recognized. As the meeting concluded with unanimous board approval of our intervention strategy, I noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in how members engaged with me versus Harold. Where they had previously directed technical questions to him while offering me social pleasantries, they now engaged directly with my strategic perspective while treating Harold with respectful but diminished deference. In the following days, our Meridian intervention team began implementing the approved strategy. The immediate transparency with affected clients, an approach Harold had resisted, yielded surprising benefits as several major customers offered flexibility on deliverable timelines in exchange for direct involvement in requirement reprioritization. Rather than damaging these relationships as Harold had feared, honest disclosure actually strengthened them through demonstrated commitment to substantive solution development, rather than surface-level impression management. 3 weeks into the Meridian restructuring, early indicators suggested promising improvement. Technical milestone achievement had increased 47%, staff retention had stabilized after months of accelerating departures, and customer satisfaction metrics showed modest but consistent recovery. The situation remained challenging, but the trajectory had clearly shifted from deteriorating crisis to managed turnaround. This visible success with a problem Harold couldn't solve despite months of isolated effort carried significance beyond the specific business challenge. Throughout the organization, it tangibly demonstrated that my leadership approach, collaborative expertise engagement, transparent assessment, and accountable execution, could resolve even inherited crises more effectively than Harold's command and control. Methodology. The contrast became particularly meaningful for the women within our organization who had previously struggled for recognition under Harold's leadership. Seeing a woman in her 70s successfully address a crisis the charismatic male leader couldn't resolve challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about authority, expertise, and leadership capability. Across departments, female managers reported increasing receptiveness to their perspectives in meetings, more equitable distribution of high-visibility assignments, and greater acknowledgement of their contributions. 6 months after assuming leadership of Wilson Enterprise Group, I sat in my office reviewing the latest quarterly results with a satisfaction that transcended mere financial metrics. The company hadn't just survived the leadership transition and Meridian crisis, it was thriving under the new collaborative management approach in ways that challenged many long-held assumptions about effective corporate governance. If you haven't seen parts 1 to 5 of this story, I recommend watching them first to understand how my husband's decision to leave me for his young secretary led to the revelation that I secretly controlled his company and how I transformed the organization after taking leadership. The Meridian turnaround had become a case study in effective crisis management. What Harold had failed to resolve through 18 months of isolated control, our collaborative team had substantially corrected in just 3 months. The software division was now meeting 82% of revised performance targets, with customer satisfaction, metrics showing steady improvement and employee retention stabilized at sustainable levels. More significant than the specific business recovery was how the process had catalyzed broader organizational transformation. Executives who had operated in protective silos under Harold's leadership now regularly engaged in cross-functional problem-solving. Middle managers previously hesitant to identify concerns for fear of being labeled negative now received recognition for surfacing issues early with potential solution approaches. Throughout the company, a culture of transparent assessment and collaborative resolution was replacing the image management and hierarchical control that had characterized Harold's era. My office intercom signaled an incoming call from Diana. "Margaret, Jennifer Sullivan is here. She's requested a brief meeting if your schedule permits." The request was unexpected. Jennifer had maintained minimal contact with headquarters since accepting the Minneapolis transfer, focusing exclusively on her regional responsibilities while carefully avoiding any interaction with senior leadership. Her presence in the main office was unusual, and her request to see me specifically suggested significant development. "Please send her in," I responded after brief consideration. Whatever her purpose, direct engagement aligned with the transparent leadership approach I had established. Jennifer entered with visible composure that didn't quite conceal her underlying tension. At 32, she remained strikingly attractive, though her presentation had evolved from the carefully cultivated allure she had projected as Harold's assistant to a more substantive professional appearance, appropriate to her current management role. "Thanks you for seeing me without an appointment," she began, taking the offered seat across from my desk. "I've completed the Minneapolis regional assessment you requested last month." The reference was to a standard operational review I had initiated across all regional offices, nothing that would typically warrant personal delivery by a mid-level manager. We both recognized this stated purpose was merely a professional pretext for a more significant conversation. "I appreciate your thoroughness," I acknowledged, accepting the report she offered. "But I suspect there's another reason for your visit to headquarters." Jennifer maintained eye contact with remarkable poise, a quality I might have appreciated under different circumstances. "Yes, I wanted to inform you personally that I've accepted a position with Eastridge Solutions, effective next month. The Minneapolis assignment provided valuable regional management experience that supported this career advancement." The subtext was clear. She was moving on from both the company and, by extension, her relationship with Harold. The professional courtesy of providing direct notice rather than simply submitting resignation through standard channels represented unexpected maturity. "Eastridge is a respected organization," I noted. "Their regional director position offers substantial responsibility." Her slight surprise at my knowledge of her specific opportunity confirmed that I maintained better awareness of industry movements than she had anticipated. My mother's lesson about maintaining comprehensive understanding beyond visible responsibilities had become standard practice throughout my career. "Yes, it's a significant step," she acknowledged, "one that wouldn't have been accessible without the management experience gained here." What remained unspoken but mutually understood was the reality that her relationship with Harold had ultimately yielded nothing beyond temporary proximity to power. The professional growth that now enabled her career advancement had come not through personal connection to the CEO, but through the structured opportunity provided after that relationship collapsed. "There's something else I felt should be addressed directly," Jennifer continued with remarkable forthrightness. "My relationship with Harold ended 3 months ago. The personal choices I made were professional errors in judgment that I've learned from significantly. While those decisions can't be undone, I wanted you to know they're not continuing. The direct acknowledgement surprised me, both the fact of their relationship ending and her willingness to address it explicitly. This wasn't information she was required to share, particularly given her imminent departure from the company. The choice to provide it anyway suggested personal growth beyond what I had observed during her time at headquarters. Personal relationships are individual choices, I replied after brief consideration. Professional boundaries exist to protect organizational integrity rather than regulate private decisions. I appreciate your directness and wish you success in your new position. As she rose to leave, Jennifer hesitated momentarily. The changes you've implemented here, the collaboration approaches, transparent assessment mechanisms, advancement pathways based on demonstrable capability rather than relationship networks, they're transformative. Many of us who never felt fully valued under previous leadership have found genuine opportunity in the new environment you've created. The unexpected acknowledgement carried particular weight coming from someone who had directly benefited from Harold's preference-based advancement system. Her recognition that merit-based standards ultimately offered more sustainable professional development than proximity to power represented meaningful perspective evolution. After Jennifer departed, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications of her update. The dissolution of her relationship with Harold seemed inevitable in retrospect. Once his corporate authority disappeared, the foundation of their connection had fundamentally changed. What remained unclear was how this development had affected Harold himself, as our interaction had remained limited to formal board matters since the Meridian disclosure. That question was unexpectedly answered the following week when Harold requested another private meeting, this time suggesting coffee at a small cafe equidistant between headquarters and the downtown apartment he had taken after selling the lake house. The neutral location and casual format suggested a different purpose than our previous business-focused discussions. Harold arrived precisely on time, his appearance noticeably changed from both his corporate persona and the slightly diminished version I had observed during the Meridian meeting. He seemed somehow unburdened, still well-groomed but without the rigid perfection he had maintained for decades, his expression more relaxed than I had seen in years. "Thank you for meeting, Margaret," he began after pleasantries. "I've been doing considerable reflection these past months, especially since Jennifer decided to pursue her career independently." The casual reference to their relationship's end confirmed Jennifer's account while suggesting Harold had processed this development with surprising equanimity. "Reflection can be valuable," I acknowledged neutrally, curious about his purpose but unwilling to direct the conversation. "I've been working with a counselor," he continued, surprising me with this voluntary disclosure. Harold had always dismissed therapeutic intervention as unnecessary weakness throughout our marriage, exploring patterns in my relationships and leadership approach. The parallels have been illuminating. "In what way?" I asked, genuinely interested in his perspective. "My need to be perceived as singularly capable created isolation in both contexts," he explained with remarkable self-awareness. "In our marriage, I systematically minimized your contributions to maintain the narrative of my independent success. At the company, I created information silos that prevented collaborative problem-solving because shared solutions threatened my perceived indispensability. The insight demonstrated surprising personal growth, an ability to recognize destructive patterns that had shaped decades of behavior. Whether this awareness had developed through professional counseling or the dramatic collapse of both his marriage and corporate authority, the result represented meaningful evolution. The Meridian situation crystallized this understanding," he continued. "Watching your team solve in months what I couldn't resolve in over a year made the limitations of my approach impossible to ignore. The contrast was instructive. Collaborative expertise engagement typically produces superior outcomes to isolated control," I observed, framing the lesson in professional rather than personal terms. Yes, Harold agreed thoughtfully. A principle I might have recognized much earlier had I viewed your business capabilities as complementary strengths rather than potential challenges to my authority. This acknowledgement, that his dismissal of my abilities had stemmed from insecurity rather than genuine assessment, represented perhaps the most honest reflection he had offered in 40 years of marriage. While it couldn't undo decades of minimization, the recognition itself held value as validation of what I had always known about the true dynamic between us. "I've been approached about a teaching position at the business school," he mentioned, shifting to his current circumstances. "Executive leadership seminars for the graduate program. The academic environment seems increasingly appealing at this stage." The role seemed appropriately aligned with his current status, allowing him to maintain professional identity through sharing experience while creating healthy distance from direct corporate authority. Teaching would provide the audience he naturally sought, without the organizational responsibility he had struggled to manage effectively. "You have valuable knowledge to share," I acknowledged sincerely, "particularly if your teaching includes both successful approaches and lessons from challenging situations. Like recognizing when your wife of 40 years might actually be the better business leader?" he suggested with unexpected self-deprecating humor. The comment wasn't bitter, but carried genuine recognition of the irony in our situation. As our conversation concluded, Harold extended an olive branch I hadn't anticipated. "The board values your leadership. The executive team has clearly thrived under your collaborative approach, and the Meridian turnaround demonstrated conclusively that your management philosophy produces superior outcomes to my more controlled method. The company is where it should be, in your capable hands." This validation, delivered without qualification or underlying resentment, represented a significant personal shift. Harold appeared to have genuinely accepted not just the legal reality of my control, but the substantive value of my leadership approach. Whether through counseling, personal reflection, or simple recognition of demonstrable results, he had evolved beyond the reflexive diminishment that had characterized our decades together. 3 weeks later, during our quarterly board meeting, Harold formally announced his resignation from both emeritus status and board membership, citing his new academic commitments and desire to create clean transition without lingering influence. The decision represented appropriate closure, removing his symbolic presence entirely to enable full organizational evolution under new leadership. With Harold's departure, the final vestiges of his management approach disappeared from company operations. The transformation I had initiated accelerated throughout the organization, with measurable improvements in key performance indicators across divisions. Employee engagement metrics showed particular growth, with staff consistently citing transparency, collaborative problem-solving, and merit-based advancement opportunities as key satisfaction drivers. Perhaps most significant was the impact on women throughout the organization. With visible female leadership demonstrating measurable success, long-established barriers began dissolving across departments. Women who had previously been overlooked for high-visibility assignments now received appropriate opportunities based on demonstrated capability rather than gender expectations. Mentorship networks formed organically, creating support structures that further accelerated professional development for talented women at all organizational levels. This internal transformation soon generated external visibility. Business publications began featuring our organizational approach as an innovative governance model, with particular focus on the performance improvements resulting from our collaborative methodology. Industry analysts noted our above-market results, attracting investor attention that drove significant stock appreciation and enhanced enterprise value. The most unexpected external impact emerged 9 months into my leadership, when I received an invitation to keynote the Women in Leadership Summit, a prestigious event featuring executives from global corporations across industries. The organizers' call explained their interest. "Your story represents exactly what our attendees need to hear: how hidden capability, strategic patience, and methodical preparation can overcome systemic barriers when opportunity finally emerges. Despite decades of intentional public invisibility, I accepted the invitation recognizing the potential value for other women facing similar circumstances. My keynote, The Power of Patient Strategy, Building Influence Without Recognition, shared the principles that had guided my 4-decade journey from dismissed wife to recognized business leader. 1 year after taking control of Wilson Enterprise Group, I stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom at the National Business Women's Conference, looking out at an audience of over 2,000 women from every sector of the business world. My keynote address, Hidden Foundations Building Power While Being Underestimated, had just concluded to unexpected standing applause. If you haven't seen parts 1-6 of this story, I recommend watching them first to understand my complete journey. From dismissed wife to recognized business leader after my husband of 40 years left me for his secretary, only to discover I secretly owned his company. Our final question comes from the young woman at microphone 3, the moderator announced, gesturing toward a professional woman in her early 30s standing confidently in the center aisle. Ms. Wilson, your story about patiently building ownership while being underestimated is inspiring, she began. But many of us work in corporate environments where equity acquisition isn't possible. How can we apply your approach in traditional employment structures? The question represented exactly why I had ultimately accepted public visibility after decades of intentional privacy. My unusual circumstances had created dramatic narrative appeal, but the underlying principles needed translation for women in more common situations. Ownership takes many forms beyond literal equity, I explained. The essential strategy is identifying where real value creation occurs in your organization and systematically developing control of those functions, whether through specialized knowledge, relationship networks, or process expertise that others depend upon but don't fully understand. Nodding heads throughout the audience suggested resonance with this perspective. Many women recognized they already controlled crucial organizational components without receiving corresponding recognition or authority. Document everything, I continued, sharing perhaps the most practical lesson from my 4-decade journey. Maintain comprehensive records of your contributions, solutions, and insights, particularly when implemented without attribution. This creates both psychological security and practical leverage when opportunity for recognition eventually emerges. As the session concluded and women lined up to speak with me individually, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation of the past year, not just in my professional position, but in my willingness to share experiences I had kept carefully private throughout my life. My keynote at the Women in Leadership Summit 9 months earlier had unexpectedly gone viral, with video excerpts generating millions of views across social platforms. Business publications requested interviews, universities invited guest lectures, and professional organizations sought insights into what they called the patient power approach to overcoming systemic barriers. After decades of intentional invisibility, I had initially hesitated to accept this public platform. Elizabeth Chen provided perspective that ultimately changed my thinking. Your story matters precisely because it contradicts expected narratives. Most women are told they must be loudly assertive or accept continued marginalization. You've demonstrated a third path, strategic patience combined with methodical capability building, that many might find more accessible than traditional approaches. This recognition that my experience might provide valuable alternative strategies for women facing similar barriers had ultimately persuaded me to share insights previously kept private. While maintaining appropriate discretion about Herald specifically, I began offering structured guidance about identifying opportunity within constraints, building influence without recognition, and preparing for eventual opportunity. The response proved far more substantial than I had anticipated. Women across industries, generations, and organizational levels reported finding practical application for these principles in their own circumstances. What had begun as reluctant public visibility evolved into meaningful dialogue about alternative approaches to navigating persistent barriers. Perhaps most significantly, these discussions expanded beyond individual strategies to address systemic issues in organizational structures themselves. Business publications began examining how traditional leadership identification focused on qualities that systematically overlooked capabilities more common in women's leadership approaches. Corporate boards initiated reviews of talent development, programs to identify unconscious filtering mechanisms that failed to recognize diverse leadership potential. Wilson Enterprise Group became an unexpected case study in this evolving conversation. Our performance metrics continued exceeding industry benchmarks across categories, with particular strength in areas requiring adaptive innovation and collaborative problem-solving. More tellingly, our executive recruitment success had improved significantly, attracting diverse talent previously skeptical about advancement potential in traditional corporate environments. The company's transformation extended beyond headquarters to impact our broader business ecosystem. Suppliers, partners, and clients increasingly adopted elements of our collaborative methodology after observing its effectiveness firsthand. Industry forums invited our executives to share insights about governance approaches that had generated our performance improvements. What had begun as internal culture correction was gradually influencing wider business practices. As the conference session concluded and I prepared to leave, Diana approached with a message that created an unexpected moment of connection between past and present. "Harold called while you were speaking," she informed me quietly. "The university has approved the business ethics curriculum you two discussed last month. He asked if you're still available for the guest lecture series on governance. Transparency." This development represented the final evolution in our reconstructed relationship. After completing his first semester teaching executive leadership, Harold had approached me with unexpected humility to discuss collaborating on business ethics, curriculum development. His classroom experiences had apparently crystallized understanding of how his leadership limitations had created ethical vulnerabilities beyond personal impact. Leadership philosophies that prioritize individual authority over collaborative verification inherently generate ethical blind spots, he had acknowledged during that conversation. I taught these approaches for decades without recognizing their governance weaknesses. Students deserve more balanced perspective based on demonstrated outcomes rather than traditional assumptions. Our tentative professional collaboration had gradually developed into a constructive working relationship entirely different from either our former marriage or traditional business partnership. Harold's academic position provided appropriate application for his experience, while creating healthy separation from direct authority, while my practical leadership insights complemented his theoretical framework with demonstrated implementation effectiveness. "Please tell him the curriculum approval is excellent news," I responded to Diana, "and confirm that the guest lecture commitment fits my schedule as planned." As we departed the conference center, Patricia joined me in the car for our return to headquarters. At 68, she had evolved from strictly legal counsel to becoming a key strategic advisor as our business continued expanding. Her perspective had proven particularly valuable in evaluating acquisition opportunities that emerged as our reputation for effective integration and collaborative leadership attracted companies seeking healthier partnership approaches. The Minneapolis regional expansion received final approval this morning, she informed me, referencing our latest strategic development. The board was particularly impressed with the integrated compliance framework built into the operational model. The Minneapolis expansion carried particular significance given its connection to Jennifer's original transfer location. What had begun as solution to an uncomfortable personnel situation had evolved into one of our strongest regional operations, demonstrating how even decisions initiated for problematic reasons could eventually yield positive outcomes through proper structural development. The team has done exceptional work designing sustainable integration pathways, I acknowledged. Michael Torres deserves particular recognition for the compliance architecture. Please ensure the board's appreciation is appropriately communicated throughout the implementation group. This deliberate attribution of achievement to the actual contributors represented perhaps the most fundamental difference between my leadership approach and Harold's previous methodology. Where he had systematically claimed credit for organizational accomplishments while minimizing others' contributions, I consistently ensured recognition reached those who created actual value regardless of hierarchical position. As we returned to headquarters, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. What had begun with personal betrayal when Harold announced his relationship with Jennifer had catalyzed complete transformation, not just in my individual circumstances, but in organizational culture, industry practices, and even Harold's own professional evolution. The most meaningful change, however, was internal rather than external. After decades of careful invisibility while building capacity without recognition, I now operated from a position of acknowledged capability and transparent influence. The psychological liberation of being fully seen for my actual contributions after years of systematic diminishment represented personal validation more significant than formal authority or public recognition. My mother's guidance about building security beneath the surface while others focused on appearances had proven prophetic in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The independence she had championed as protective measure had ultimately enabled me to reshape an entire organization when opportunity finally emerged through unexpected circumstances. As I entered the headquarters building, now without any hesitation, about using the executive entrance or occupying leadership space, I recognized how completely my relationship with the company had transformed. What had once been Harold's business that I secretly supported had become an authentic reflection of collaborative leadership principles I had always valued but seldom been able to implement openly. Diana met me at the elevator with the afternoon schedule and a small package that had arrived while I was at the conference. "This came from your mother's attorney," she noted with characteristic efficiency. "Marked personal and time-sensitive." Opening the package in my office, I discovered a leather-bound journal I immediately recognized, despite not having seen it for decades. My mother's business diary from when she first assumed leadership of our family's textile company after my father's death. A note from the elderly attorney explained he had recently found it while organizing archived materials and felt I should have this family legacy. The journal fell open naturally to a page where my mother had written words that could have been composed yesterday rather than nearly 60 years earlier. "They dismiss me as merely the founder's widow temporarily managing until a proper businessman takes control. Their underestimation provides perfect cover while I restructure operations to create sustainability they cannot imagine. Let them believe what comfortable assumptions they wish. Results will eventually speak with unchallengeable authority." The entry crystallized the generational connection that had shaped my entire approach. My mother hadn't merely taught me about financial independence as abstract concept. She had modeled the patient power strategy from direct experience, guiding me to build strength beneath the surface while others focused on appearances. What I had implemented over decades at Wilson Enterprise Group reflected principles she had developed through similar challenges in a different era. This recognition of my place within continuing legacy of women turning underestimation into strategic advantage provided perfect closure to the year's extraordinary journey. From dismissed wife to recognized business leader, from hidden influence to acknowledged authority, from private strategy to public inspiration, each transition had built upon foundations established by women who had navigated similar barriers before me. If my story resonates with your own experiences of being underestimated while quietly building capability, I hope you'll take away 3 essential principles that transcend my specific circumstances. First, strategic patience is not surrender. It's calculated positioning for eventual opportunity that others cannot anticipate because they've never truly seen your capabilities. Second, documentation creates both psychological security and practical leverage. Maintain comprehensive records of your contributions, solutions, and insights, particularly when implemented without attribution. And finally, when opportunity for recognition eventually emerges, lead with collaborative approaches that elevate others, rather than replicating the hierarchical control that previously limited your own potential. My husband of 40 years left me for his secretary without realizing I owned his company. That moment of crisis became the catalyst for transformation far beyond personal vindication, creating ripple effects that continue expanding through organizations, industries, and individual lives as more women recognize the power of patient strategy in overcoming persistent barriers. The capacity you're building while being underestimated today is creating foundation for influence that those who dismiss you cannot imagine. Your moment of recognition may emerge through circumstances entirely different from mine, but the preparation that makes you ready for that opportunity follows universal principles that transcend specific situations. Build beneath the surface, document everything, and prepare methodically for opportunities others don't believe you deserve. The results will eventually speak with unchallengeable authority. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.